Good evening, everyone. My name is Rebecca Gookool, and I am going to be your chair for this evening's session on reflecting on the post-independence economy. Trinidad and Tobago gained independence on the 31st of August, 1962. In his Independence Day address, then Prime Minister Dr. Eric Williams admonished that the nation must recognize that indiscipline, whether individual or sectional, is a threat to democracy. Slacking on the job jeopardizes the national income, inflates cost, and merely sets a bad example. It is also to strengthen our democracy by improving our economic foundations. As such, one can conclude that the democratic strength of the economy is reflected by its overall economic performance. This session reflects on just that conversation. The economic performance of the TNT economy, absolutely and relatively, since 1962, with a focus on economic drivers, the changing in the structure of the GDP, of our GDP structure, and performance in terms of key macroeconomic variables. This evening, we have on our panel, Mrs. Karen Nunez Teixeira, Dr. Tawari, and Dr. Roger Hossain of the Trade and Economic Development Unit to ventilate this topic. I would like to encourage you to keep your microphones muted, to use the chat feature should there be questions or comments that emerge throughout the discussion, and also to remember that our session is being live streamed via YouTube. I will share the YouTube link via the chat, so you can also use that link to share it on your various platforms. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Ms. Karen Nunez Teixeira, who is an attorney at law with special interest in employment and family law. She holds a postgraduate diploma in international relations from the Institute of International Relations, UWI, and an executive MBA from the Arthur Lockjack Graduate School of Business. She is the recipient of the Nuttall Field Fellowship, and she's also the author of 3 Commonwealth Caribbean legal texts. For the last 20 years, or for almost 20 years, Ms. Nunez Teixeira was a course director at the Hugh Wooding Law School, and from 2003 to 2007 was appointed to the position of senior tutor at the same institution until she resigned to enter the field of politics. For the period 2007 to mid-2010, she was a member of Parliament and Cabinet, appointed as the Minister of Finance in the government of Trinidad and Tobago. From 2010 to 2014, Mrs. Teixeira was a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Law, Cave Hill, UWI. Currently, her interests are focused on discussing as well as writing articles through the various media on issues which impact the socioeconomic landscape of this country. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to Ms. Teixeira, and I'm also going to let you know that I will be assisting her with transitioning through her presentation for this evening. Ms. Teixeira, go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for that welcome, and of course to your listeners. As you said, it's a conversation, so, and I have a limited time, as we all do, so I'm going to try and keep it into the snapshots of what I consider to be the major factors that affected our economy from 1962, the year of our independence, to today. So we start by looking at really at on the next slide, what we consider to be the guideposts or the matters that we should be looking at. And obviously, we all know up to today, they're reliant on the energy sector. It determines our fortunes and misfortunes. In looking at what has continued to be the story of Trinidad and Tobago, we look at it through discrete periods based on major events which have impacted the economy and by extension, our socioeconomic development. And of course, as you already indicated, we will be using, and I will use to the extent that we can, the key macro indicators, which will, of course, be relevant and emphasize the point that we hope to be making as the state of our economy from post-independence. I think one of the things that I would have liked to have seen much more of is the Gini coefficient. And from my own doing, my own research, unfortunately, they've stopped doing it since 1991. That is the CSO. So they can probably explain the reason for that. So to the next slide, which ends with a brief review of the economy and a summary of some proposed prescriptions and what I consider the major barriers for us moving forward. And to me, many of you may not want to voice it, may not want to articulate it, but the corruption legislation, the policies, the lack of implementation, from my point of view, is rooted in the drug trade, which is a bad word to use in Trinidad and Tobago. But that is my assessment. So we move on now to the topic of today, which is the post-colonial realities. Now, what was interesting to me, and I just want to make a point, go back to yes, we can stay here. What was interesting to me was when I was doing the research, I found out that for a long time in the World War II period, when the Americans were here and they were leasing shagaramas, that many people were employed in the construction industry. The population was about 600 and something thousand. Over 30,000 of them were persons were working in the construction industry, building the highways, were getting very good salaries. But more importantly, a middle class was emerging from a developing country, which was almost unheard of. And with that, the expectations of a better standard of living, and expectations that their life will be better, an expectation that they will get a good house to live in. So that sense of I wouldn't say entitlement, but expectation wasn't just driven by the energy sector, but before the energy sector really took over. In fact, the GDP in agriculture, they contributed 17% to our GDP, and they really was quite a very viable agricultural sector, mainly because of import restrictions. So we reached 1962 and to 1970, and that's where we see the post-colonial, next slide, and we see the population had grown a little. We see that the revenue and expenditure were about equal, so there were small fiscal deficits. And now we see what the GDP per capita, but remember, we're dealing with 1962. So if you look at it, $679 per capita for the real GDP, that's if you take out inflation. The value of imports increased significantly, and our import cover had gone to 4.8 months of import cover, and by 1960, towards the end of the 1970, 2.3 months. So things were going in a downward trend towards the end of 1970. Started okay, but then as we go in towards 1970, towards that period, we're seeing the problems emerging. Next slide. And inflation, well, inflation, there was a high in 1967, but I think the inflation, low inflation, was really a response to not demand pull, but a cost push. Economy was still sluggish. Yes, oil had become important. A tax shell had entered into the Trinidad and Tobago economy in the late 1950s. And you see the decline in agriculture, as I indicated, and by 1970, it had gone down to 6%. And the real GDP increased on average by 10%, but that's by 1961. So economic expectations, as I indicated, increased. People had an expectation of a high standard of living. They said, if we were treated like this under the colonial master, then we expect that when we become independent, that we will enjoy a good standard of living. And to a large extent, that movement was moved by the intellectual middle class, as we eventually discovered with 1973. So increased demand for national ownership and resentment to the foreign control intensified post-independence. So we go on to the next slide, and this continued. You see the unemployment level pretty high. In 1967, 16.7%. In 1970, 12.8%. The Point Lisa's industrial estate was established, but it was really dealing with wire rods. It wasn't really what the Point Lisa's industrial estate is today. UNESCO look at education. I mean, yeah, just surprising. You had over 41,000 students sitting what we call the common entrance at the time, and only about 5,000 getting places in secondary schools, whether they were aided or government schools or government assisted. And the post-primary education for 12 to 15 years for those who, many of the students who just could not get a place in a government secondary school or government assisted school. So that was the state of education in that period. So you can very well imagine that with that environment, we transition now to the period which I call 1970 to 1973. And why I use 1970, we all know that is the period of the so-called Black Power Revolution. And I put the word revolution in italics because I wouldn't say it's a revolution, but it was a changing of the guards for sure. And an expectation led by the middle class, led by the intellectuals, and it was happening all over the world. It was happening in, I know it started at a university in Canada, but we had the civil rights movement, we had Cuba, we had the ANC movement in Africa, and all these countries and all these former colonial countries wanting their independence and wanting to be able to hold the reins of power in their country, and that meant financial power. So the next slide. And so, and we see that happening, the economic deterioration happening, unemployment averaging 15% by 1973, inflation rising to 14.8%, independence, not the promise of a better quality of life. And you see the three main drivers of the economy: oil, banking, and insurance, major revenue earners, with 86% of the leadership either foreign or local white community. So that, of course, culminated, as we all know. You went in the bank, that's the reality. You went in the bank, and if you saw a black face, it was a tea lady serving tea. And that was the reality for us and for us as a, and there was this middle class that had this expectation. So we saw then the culmination of that in the so-called Black Power Revolution. People speaking out of their dissatisfaction, and of course the played a great part in it with the unions. We know with the Butler riots and the ISA, which they wanted to stop any form of marching or any sort of form of taking any kind of industrial action, striking, etc. And that was the environment in which we were in. And the government, I suppose, had to respond to that, because part of the response was that they increased secondary placement to 10,476 for 30,000 students who sat the exam that year. Next slide. Yeah, so I think that to a large extent explains why employment practices would have changed, where suddenly you saw in the banks, in the airlines, in the insurance industry, in the oil industry, you saw more people of color, Indo-Trinidadians, Afro-Trinidadians, qualified Trinidadians taking up positions which were closed off to them. And the government responding by nationalizing a number of privately owned companies. And that is, I think, in response at the time to the circumstances of wanting to be in control of our destiny, wanting to be in control of the engines of growth that had been so long, we were so long deprived of. Next slide. So this was, I guess, a gift when we entered into 1973 to early 1980s, because that's a period where they said money is no problem, and it looked like that was really true. So as we can see on the next slide, it gives you an indication of what was happening. Foreign exchange reserves moved from 500 million to $3.3 billion US. Energy prices, oil prices had quadrupled. Revenue from oil had gone from 20 to 40%. Capital expenditure, and that is a big one, because that means you're spending on roads, on the highways, on hospitals, on schools in particular, moved from 5% in 1973 to almost 20% by 1981. The GDP per capita was in the vicinity of 6,259, and the population was about 1 million. Inflation, however, I guess a result of what was going on, what we call the overheating, some people will say, of the economy, all of these things happening, this this oil prices increasing and demand for us to develop and to expand our electricity, our water, our roads, our hospitals, our schools. So you saw the inflation rate reaching 22% in 1974, and by 1983, 17.7%. Well, that is definitely a case of demand pull inflation, which cannot be good for you, for the country, because it means your purchasing power is affected. But that was the time when money was no problem, and it was being driven by the energy sector. Next slide. So the early 1980s, again, as I said, that money no problem persisted. And as I indicated, the government decided to make some investments in privately owned entities. So they either took a majority or minority ownership in oil, gas, utilities, and some banking. Construction industry grew significantly. And as we all know, well, agriculture shrank by 25%, local manufacturing grew, GDP grew, unemployment was started to slow down from a high 15.4% by to 11.1%, which was still high, still a high level of unemployment, but that was the reality of the day. And of course, you saw them paying attention to the education by establishing. We're not looking at this discussion, I expect, is not about the pros and cons of the system, because we know there's much we could say about much of what I've already said. And that goes for the junior secondary system with the double shift system, followed by the 2 years of senior secondary. We know that it was more than a good exercise for the country. It was not, did not turn out to be something that was positive, but of course we don't have the time to focus on that. So we move on now from the money no problem to the period of collapsed energy prices. Remember, we started by saying our fortunes fall and our fortunes rise on the backs of energy. And so you did experience that. And the population now was a little over 1 million. The foreign exchange saw the decline from 7.7 billion in 1983 to 1989 to 4.3 billion. We saw the fiscal deficit increasing significantly to 3.6%, at least based on what it had been prior to that. And we saw unemployment, my goodness, an averaging 22% by 1986 to 1989. That's a quarter of your employable. It depends on how you define unemployment too, because then you look at people who are actively seeking jobs within a specified period. But however you choose to define unemployment, by any stretch of imagination, to have a quarter of your population, your employable population, unemployed is significant. According to UNESCO, again, that's another one, how you determine poverty. Is it going to be 190, as Dr. Usaina suggested, per day? Is it going to be the old one where it was 3 times a daily requirements of food in 1963? Or is it going to be the new one, a supplemental poverty indicator, which takes into account a number of things which provide some education, provide free transportation, a number of things that we will call free that you would otherwise have had to provide for yourself. But however you look at it, according to UNESCO, 38% of the population was living under the poverty line in 1997. And the GDP per capita by the end of 1989 was 3,532. Not a good picture. So we move on. Inflation. And if you're looking at a situation with an economy collapsing really and declining, to have an inflation rate of 17.7, decline to 7.7, but then going back up to 11.4%. I don't know if that's the time when the central bank governor, it may not have been, where you say we're going down a slippery slope when inflation had reached 10%. I think that was maybe a little later on when the overheating economy discussion took place. But in any case, we see what's happening with sugar production, 3.4% of the GDP, and we're seeing negative growth on an average of 4.8 per annum, and devaluation of the dollar twice during that period, 240 and then the 360 to the US dollar. And of course, important, the July 1990 coup. Again, a reflection of why do you have civil unrest? Why do you have socioeconomic unrest? Because people who are the which make up the majority of the population, are feeling the economic pinch, are feeling the financial pinch, and they're only way that they think, if they feel they're not being heard, if they're not being listened to, and nothing is being done to assist their position, then they figure the only power they have is to take matters into their hand, and that is something that is commonplace all over the world. I'm not advocating it, but I'm just saying that is a reality that governments sometimes have to understand, that people not only can vote once every 5 years, but they can also express their dissatisfaction. I don't subscribe to 1992. It caused a lot of destruction to the economy. A lot of people lost their lives, but it was driven by the economic situation in the country, as it is in most countries. That is the driver. So you see the next slide speaks to that. And I suppose it was a hard and difficult time for the government during this period to make difficult choices, because the foreign exchange reserves were almost, we had reached the bottom of the barrel for a country with a population of over 1 million. So tough decisions were made, and tough decisions that affected, of course, public sector and public sector wages, which was one of the major sources of debt for the government. So suspension of the cost of living in 1987, suspension of the merit increases for public officers, cut in transfers and subsidies, sale of unprofitable state enterprises. Well, I'm not sure why they were unprofitable, but they were sold. And modification of direct tax structure. I think VAT was introduced in 89-90. 10% cut in public sector wages. And of course, we had further devaluation and a further decline in the socioeconomic welfare of the population. And I think, given my own, go to the next slide, and this is just giving my own take on it. I may be very wrong, but it's just an opinion. I think that that period was a period of good intention. I think the government of that time had the interest of the country at heart and were doing what they believed was the right things to do. And I, to a large extent, they did make some difficult choices, but I think that the problem may have been their inability, or I shouldn't say inability, their lack of reading the pulse of the country, reading the pulse of the nation, because it may come across as though they're not understanding that the people are becoming restless, and there are people who take advantage of that restlessness, and they will have people who are willing to follow that. I don't know if this is true, and I'm sure Dr. Hussain will put me right on this, but I was told that the last straw, so to speak, that set the whole coup ablaze, so to speak, was that it was suggested that a statue be costing $30,000 be erected to honor Jean Miles, who was considered a martyr and been martyred by a former administration. But that's the reality. So we go on to 1990 to 1999. This is where we get a big change from an oil economy, a lot of mature fields, to a natural gas economy. So it comes on lower down in the points, but that's where we saw the change happening around 1993, 1994. So the real GDPs continue to decline, GDP per capita seeing a similar, a movement higher up in 1994, because it's around that time that we saw the implementation, the realization of the move from to introducing LNG, the LNG with Train 1. Around 93, 94, that's when it was realized. The fiscal deficit was averaging 1.9%, so not too bad. And the foreign exchange reserves, considering where we were in 1992, no wonder the government of the day had a difficult time to look at a foreign exchange reserves of 83.8 million with a population of over 1 million. That's a difficult situation to face and to try to remedy. By 1996, it had reached 532 million. Not a whole lot, but certainly much better than what it was. And there was debt servicing, wanting to draw down on the debt, which we had. And so instead of taking on more debt and borrowing more, servicing in debt, and did so during that period in 1994. Next. Inflation averaged, towards the end at 3.4%. Unemployment, well, that's a big difference from 1990. The year we grew up 20%. By 1999, it was 13.1%. And of course, managed growth of the dollar in 1993. Children going to school, adults going to school. Are they getting passes? Are they what you call functional literates? I'm sure people may say that, but UNESCO says that Trinidad has a literate population over 15 plus, once over 15 years, 18 or 15 years and over, I think 99.8, nearly 100%. But we won't argue that issue of literacy. But a major change, major direction, the Atlantic LNG, which was the first LNG plant in the Western Hemisphere for 20 years. And that was really the beginning of our economy moving from oil to gas. And so now we go to 2000 and 2010, the period of economic boom, really driven by the natural gas. Next slide. Yeah, so population grew a little bit, but look at that foreign exchange reserves, reaching by 2009, 10.6 billion. Unemployment dropping from 12.1 to 5.9. This is the overheating period I expect. GDP per capita, I mean, in 2008, it was 21,410 in 2008. And then we had the global financial crisis of 2008, around October of 2008. But nevertheless, in 2010, we still had a GDP per capita of over 16, nearly 17,000. Inflation, I guess that's the inflation, the slippery slope that the central bank governor must have been speaking about when he saw inflation rising to over 10% going in that direction. Of course, that's not a good thing if you have what you call, in that case, demand pull, too few goods to supply the needs or the demand. Debt to GDP, still reasonable, certainly given that our unemployment rate had gotten down dramatically, foreign exchange reserves were increasing significantly, the outlook was positive, so that all in all, a debt to GDP going to 68% by 2008. Maybe you wouldn't want it to go to that, because at one point it was about 45%, to be a much lower vicinity than that in just a few years before that, but it had reached to 68% by 2008. Next slide. Yeah. So major event was a global financial crisis. And with that major financial crisis, so did the price of oil go down. I remember that I went to the World Bank then, and head of the, I think it's the IMF, he had a meeting with us. And I had just gone up for the meeting, and prices of oil were $100, over $100. That was what it was, and had been so for quite a while. And I said, what's the outlook for 2009? This is in October 2008. I was asking this in September. He said, oh, at least $100. By the next month or two, it literally collapsed with the global financial crisis. By January, the price of oil was $23. But it eventually recovered. Well, major advancement in education, establishment of UTT in 2004, COSTAT among other vocational institutions, enrollment at UWI grew, and we saw a significant increase in not only enrollment in graduates, so we saw the knowledge and education be put front and center. Next slide. So we reach now. There's a French saying, I don't know if I can say it well, and so if anybody is a French speaker, they might put me in my place, but I'll try my best. And that is la pluie sans change, la pluie c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they remain the same. And that certainly is Trinidad and Tobago. We still have, driven by our dependency on energy. Next slide. And when we talk energy now, we're including methanol, ammonia, urea, potash, including that, the downstream industries as well as the upstream industries. So GDP per capita, not bad, 16,174 in 2017 and 2020. Well, what has been happened around that time, which I'll just deal with briefly, 15,000. And debt to GDP had gone up significantly. And some say it's more like 89% now, and that the next forecast from the central bank probably will be in the vicinity of 89%. And that's not good at all, because I do believe our current Minister of Finance had given the undertaking that it would never cross over 65%. But apparently that happened a little while ago. The foreign exchange reserves, well, we had a high of 11.4 billion in 2014. And very soon it kept going down to what it is today, 6.9 billion. And as we all know, everybody who's listening knows that that's really not our foreign exchange reserves, because a lot of that is made up of our HSF deposits. I believe the minister has gone into the HSF at least 8 times, not necessarily only to, for the foreign exchange reserves, but certainly has used it to prop up our foreign exchange reserves artificially, in my estimation, as well as issuing a bond, taking on debt. And of course, well, everyone got the special drawing rights. So that 6.9 billion is not reflecting the value of our exports. In fact, it is an artificial figure, which really is being propped up by other factors which do not reflect the state and the health of the economy. The unemployment, I think the central bank is now saying we're looking at 7.5%. And we know with unemployment, we include CPEP, all those social programs and URP, they're included. So I wonder if there should be a separate classification called underemployment. Because if your job, whatever the job is, cannot sustain you at a basic needs that you headline inflation, that basket that you put together, and can't sustain your basic needs, then I wonder if we can really call it unemployment, or should we talk about underemployment and employment if you want to get a real picture of the reality of Trinidad. Next slide, I think we're coming to the end. Inflation, as well, economy is sluggish, so one won't expect high inflation. It's about 1%, and of course it has gone up somewhat within the last 2 years, and it's been driven by what we call food inflation. So when you take out of the core inflation, the most volatile item is food. Everybody has to eat, so that's a serious thing. It's an important item in our basket. And when people, and we're talking about people, especially at the lower end, can't afford to eat because we import 86% of our food. And at the same point in time, we have spent a huge budget on our health. The health budget is Ministry of Health, a huge budget, and much of that is for non-communicable diseases, such as which we call lifestyle diseases. That's another discussion. So food inflation, as I said, has gone up. And in the fourth quarter of 2021, well, we know it has to have a positive growth because the budget starts in October of 2021. And we know we don't have time to go through all the reasons, but I'm sure you're familiar with the reasons why natural gas, I mean, it was budgeted at 365, and for once you got it more than right, the minister, that is, because a natural gas is going for between $6, even $7. And oil, although we are not really an oil producing economy anymore, and we certainly shut down the refinery, but I think Heritage is, I think they have about 61,000 barrels per day, and oil is going in the vicinity of 90 to 100 and $200, and we don't expect that to change in a hurry. Why the closure of the refinery? We could spend a lot of time on that, but we don't have the time. But I personally think it doesn't seem to make too much sense to have parallel trading, say we're making a profit of 350 million, but spending $250 million in order to import refined fuel. But that is another conversation. But definitely, again, we see energy driving not only LNG, but driving the downstream industry. I think we're coming to the end. Yeah, right. So yeah, the COVID disruption. Go ahead. Which we know impacted. I'm not going to speak too much on that. It impacted the small and medium enterprises, an increase in retrenchment, increase in food inflation, the supply chain management, unemployment. We know the whole story, buffered by HSF deposits, by international support and financing. So that did have an impact, no question about it, on our fortunes. But just remember, it didn't start in 2020. If you go back to 2017, 2018, 2019, you know that we were already in trouble. So while the government likes to blame COVID, if they look back at their data, they will realize the problem existed far before COVID struck. It just gave them, exacerbated an existing problem and gave them something that they could blame for their problems. So concluding remarks and proposed scripture. I think I will skip the concluding remarks because I'll go to the next one, because I think it's been pretty clear. Go to the, okay, that's there. I think my concluding remarks, what I really want to say that is a real problem for Trinidad is the income inequality as persisted as a main barrier to sustainable national development. The Gini coefficient, which measures the distribution of income in an economy over a particular period. The last time they did it was 1991. I went into CSO, I asked the head of CSO, I said, why have you all stopped giving the Gini coefficient numbers? Since 1991, he couldn't give me a good answer. And so that's something that will help us really to understand without having to guess how the inequalities in our economy. And it is driven by crime and corruption. The Prime Minister said it. He said, Trinidad is a corrupt society. He said, Trinidad is a violent society. And if your Prime Minister says so, I think you should listen to him. I think he knows what he's talking about. And we understand, in no question, I understand, and I have no question about that, that what is the main barrier to us achieving any meaningful economic diversity is dealing with the cocaine, disrupting the cocaine transshipment. That is the answer, in my view. Last, prescriptions, which I suppose everyone has many of my prescriptions now in the last slide. So we know we want to see a vibrant small medium enterprise, because without a middle class, you really have a country so divided that cannot sustain itself and develop as it should. We need food security. I see the Prime Minister is going off to Guyana, and I think that's a good move. I assume that he's taken advantage of the amount of acreage they have to develop, give us some level of food security, as well as develop an agro-industry in the same way we develop the polylesis by adding value to a product which was either natural gas, but the natural gas, and in this case, local fruits, vegetables, cocoa, even sugar. I saw a man, I saw read in the papers, a man who was doing organic sugar. So even the sugar, if you are a targeted market, you can go with, you can looking at sugar as a possibility. And as I have said, in Barbados, they still go sugar cane, but for their distillery. So cultural tourism, I think, is a really important area for us to develop. We don't have the time to go through it, but I think what is missing is there's no cohesive, coherent, and sustained messaging, no marketing strategy outlined, and the components should include community development and the agro-industry. But I really don't think that there is a real commitment. I think they're happy to kick the can down the road, and right now oil and gas is doing well. To what extent are we benefiting when you have to pay the fuel subsidy, when you have to use much of your foreign exchange to pay for the refined oil? Not too sure, but that's the state of play in Trinidad and Tobago. I think this will be the last slide. So the National Statistical Institute, we heard about it how many times? I think in the last budget he didn't mention it. He said, you know, I keep promising this National Statistical Institute and it's not emerging. And the IMF said that to them, you can't manage what you don't measure. Well, maybe they don't want to measure what they can't measure it for whatever reason. So we will be able to find out really what is the Gini coefficient, what is the rate of poverty in the country, what is the unemployment in this country. And one of the things which I had spoken to with someone, actually a relative of mine, a young person who had gone to university and was complaining, I spent all that time in UWE and I was glad that I went to UWE, but I have this degree, and other people who didn't do well in school and they have degrees now. I said, you know, you don't understand, it's about developing your country and becoming a knowledge economy. But no question, there is a need, and it is a law, and it was identified some years ago, alignment of our education and our vocational programs to the needs and the goals of the economic sector once you have determined what they are. And what the government has done is facilitated the increase in equality. We don't have the time to discuss it in any detail, but definitely the procurement law, the revenue authority, which they have been able to dilute, so it no longer requires a 3/5 majority. Gambling legislation, the private-public partnerships, who are the only ones that can participate are the wealthy. And curiously enough, when we looked at the corruption perception index, one of the measures of corruption in Trinidad and Tobago, which has a 40% which is really unacceptable, is the red tape. You know what that means, of course. If you are the little man, they will spin you around. The doctor didn't come in today to get the health certificate. You have to come in next Wednesday for this. You have to come in, they spin you around. Some people click their fingers and that certificate is on their thing. You can't compete. You cannot compete. So I think we keep saying the last slide, but I think this or the next one is yes. And that's my last slide. I say the root of the crime and murder that we all complain about, if you'll be honest with ourselves, is unlicensed guns, it's gangs. Something is feeding the gangs, and something is causing gangs, persons who are working in CPEP and URP or whatever, it certainly can't pay them what that can pay them. And until we get serious about dealing with disrupting the cocaine trade in this country, we are spinning top in mud, and we will not be able to achieve the goals that I have discussed and the diversity I think that is absolutely necessary for Trinidad and Tobago. That is something I had just for myself. So that's the end, and thank you for listening, and it was my pleasure to present on the topic.
Mr. Shara, thank you very much for your time. And for that review from the period 1962 to present. Given that I know that Dr. Hussain has a presentation also prepared for this conversation, and I suspect that this presentation will complement yours or the presentation that has gone before, because it is generally data rich. I'm going to allow Dr. Hussain to go ahead and share your screen so that we can allow you to present first, and then Dr. Tawari to comment. Dr. Hussain, you can share your screen and you can unmute your mic, please.
Yes, good night.
You
need to enable me. Okay, so you have enabled me. Right. Now, I must say that, are you all hearing me, Rebecca?
Yes.
I listened to Karen intently. Very good presentation, Karen. I was impressed, and this, I was impressed as a professional economist who understand the data well. I like your sequential flow, how you took the audience through in a very careful, calm way from the early period right up to 2021. There isn't much that I disagreed with you with. Most of what you said, I agreed. I was surprised to hear about the cocaine trade and the emphasis you placed on it in the end. And no doubt in the places that you said it's your kind of feel, and you probably could elaborate on that later on. For me, I was surprised. The reality of this economy, you know, I only have 5 slides. I don't want to speak long. I prefer to listen to you and Dr. Tiwari. You all are more sensible anyway and experienced. And the reality of this economy, though, when you look at it, when you take a long wave 60-year anniversary independence perspective, I cannot say it. It leaves you with a sense of frustration. You know, I know this data. I understand this data well, and I look at this data sometimes 20 times for the day for different things, and it leaves you almost, you know, I remember, and Dr. Tiwari would probably be able to relate to this well. I remember in the book a house for Mr. Biswas. Someone was going abroad for a scholarship, and I think the car was reversing out of the yard, and they placed a cup of milk in a corner of the yard. And the story is that if it is the car were to spill the milk, the boy will not return back to Trinidad. So somehow the car in reversing knocked the cup of milk down that was in a corner of the yard out of the driveway. Well, the mother started to bawl and all kind of thing and say, well, she saw them coming back and all this kind of thing. But when I look at the Trinidad and Tobago economy, I ask myself simplistically, how did we allow ourselves to end up exactly where we shouldn't reach? And it gets me, you know, when I listen to Minister Imbert in particular, it gets me concerned some of the comments others make as to basically all is well. In fact, recently he said Trinidad and Tobago GDP is almost back to 170 billion. He didn't say it is nominal terms, but nominal GDP, and he is correct. It's nearly back to 170 billion. Our peak GDP was 177 billion in nominal terms. So it left me feeling that the minister is saying, well, all is well, and things is going back to peak activity. And for those of us who follow this type of data, and I know Professor Gonzalez is on as well, that's not correct, because when you convert $170 billion today and compare it to the 2014 number that was 177, the $170 billion today could buy about 19% less than what it could have bought in 2014. That's a significant difference. And in my understanding of the facts, when the lay people hear that and take a guitar and jump up and start to play and say, well, everything good and back to normal, we are almost misleading them, because Karen outlined a series of numbers. I heard you talk about the unemployment rate and inflation and whatnot, that point in my understanding of the numbers in a different direction. So just quickly, you know, this is the oil production and oil prices, and we produce quite a bit of oil since 1955 and certainly since 1962, and we were able to benefit from two really strong periods of oil prices, one in the 70s and one again with the energy commodity price super cycle between 1999 and 2014. The current period, because of the Ukraine war, we are seeing some pluses there. Natural gas production is, you know, significantly high today as compared to, say, in the 1980s, but it is much less lower than 2010. And the economy is heavily dependent on natural gas production. And although we may be getting a little bleep in price, in general, when compared to 2010, both price and production of natural gas is down. So I don't know how much of a boom we will get in energy revenues across this fiscal year. And when you look at the real effective exchange rate, which to me is one of the most troubling variables. In fact, it's the first variable I tend to look at every annual report. I look for the real effective exchange rate, because it tells me a lot of things about the economy. And you could see that it is very, very much appreciated, which is not good. And natural gas rent, natural resource rent, it is much lower than it was in the period 2004 to 2012 or thereabout, or the golden era of LNG. And I heard Karen mention some of these type of numbers in different ways. Where is the Trinidad and Tobago economy today in relation to other parts of the globe? And certainly, what I am seeing in the data, and I looked at the data from 1980 to 2026 using IMF numbers, and we are being relatively pauperized. Our GDP is growing at a slower pace than the world, which is not good. If it is, you live in a relative and absolute world, and your income is growing slower than everyone around you, then you are becoming relatively poorer, and that's not good. So everyone else would be able to, certainly if you are a university lecturer, and I speak in my personal capacity here, you would see all your colleagues moving ahead of you in life and your income being unable to buy anything much. That's relative pauperization. And to summarize all of this, I would simply show this graph here. And this graph, to me, Karen, summarizes a lot of what you said in one place. It shows the relative ranking of the Trinidad and Tobago GDP out of 195 countries. So once you see numbers less than 35, in my view, it means you are the top 35 worst performing economies in the world. And nobody would want that. So there was the golden era right after PM Manning floated the dollar. From 93, 94, 95, 96, straight up to 2008, thereabouts. Now, I generally don't focus on the period 1999 to 2006 in Trinidad, because to me, what we had, those high bars there because of what I would call geographic growth. And you used to hear the former president of BP, he was an accountant, his name slips me now, always talk about taking gas from under the ground and bring it above the ground, which is what we did. We took gas from under the ground that had economic value and brought it above the ground and changed its level of economic activity so things look nice and good. But let us see what happened after 2010 when the gas production peaked. You could see that after 2010, you started to see numbers well, after 2000, you started to see numbers like 38, 21, 32, 53, 15, 9, 15, 20, 19, 15. And those numbers worry me. In other words, for all the efforts we are making, we are growing, or we are ranked in the top 35, not percent. It's much lower than that, maybe about 17 to 20%. We are ranked in the top 35 worst performing economies in the world out of 195 countries based on IMF data. Now, I know that if I was in a class with 195 students and the best student would get a mark of 195 and my mark always less than 35, first I would get curtailed when I go home, and then I wouldn't want to go home, I would feel shame. So I am concerned, and this to me is the summary of the management of the Trinidad and Tobago economy. And when I have to face in a university class, even young people like Rebecca and Christian Seeley and some of my students are on, and they ask me about these numbers post 2010, it's an agonizing feeling. It's a feeling as if I had a small role, I collectively had a small role to play in watching their economic rents for them, and I let them down. And now we are struggling, and the struggle is real, because whilst we may get a little buoyancy in oil and gas prices because of the Ukraine-Russia situation, if that Ukraine-Russian situation didn't take place, 2022 may be a contractionary year, that's one. And two, the trend in our comparative advantage goods, oil and gas in particular, is downward. And I saw unofficially some gas sector numbers today that shows a continuing decline in the gas production. So anyway, with this one graph here, I would stop and I would field whatever questions later on. But so thank you very much, Rebecca.
Thank you, Dr. Hussein. You can stop sharing. And I noted Dr. Tiwari, he is currently having some technical issues. So I am going to just reflect a little bit on the presentation. Specifically, Dr. Hussein, I particularly appreciated the last graph, which mapped some of the indicators that Ms. Teixeira would have looked at against TNT's relative position in the global space. And I think that's important for us to understand. I would also like to encourage the audience, if you have a question, and I notice that we do have a question in the chat, I would like to invite Mr. Sita Harman to unmute your mic and direct your question accordingly.
Thank you. But I wrote the question in the chat because the first speaker emphasized on the debt to GDP ratio, which has been consistently increasing, but not to the level of many other countries. So I just wanted her to explain if that is a warning signal, the rate of change, rate of increase in the debt to GDP ratio. Thank you.
Ms. Karen,
Well,
you need to, yes,
yeah.
go ahead and unmute your mic. Go ahead.
Well, everything is contextual. So obviously, if you take the GDP and you look at it in a silo and look at it in and of itself, it's not a good thing to have a high debt to GDP. I mean, but many countries do have high debt to GDP. United States certainly is one of the countries. But the issue is, are you able to service that debt? And when you see Moody's or Standard & Poor's, I believe, downgrade us in the energy sector, which is the breadbasket of Trinidad and Tobago, then you have to wonder, how is the country going to be able to service that debt over the long term? Because you're comparing how much debt you have to the value of the goods you produce in that particular year. And at the end of the day, if you keep on taking on debt and the debt keeps on growing, it means you're not either servicing the debt, you're not able to produce whatever is necessary to reduce the debt. And when you put that together with the unemployment rates and the inflation and all of that, I think it's a matter of concern. I think Jamaica actually had reached 142% to their GDP, and the IMF came in and helped them, and they were able to bring it down to 100%. So I think it's important that you get your time. Dr. Hossain is the economist here, so I see his face, and I would want him to step in, but that is how I see the debt to GDP becoming important for as a macroeconomic indicator.
Dr. Hussain, before you comment, I noticed Dr. Tawari has rejoined us. Dr. Tawari, are you hearing us now? Can you unmute your mic?
Are you hearing me?
Yes, we're hearing you now.
All right, okay.
So may I invite you to post your perspective on the presentation, on the conversation. I know perhaps parts of it you may have missed on the general economic environment from your experience.
Well, what I would say is that I only heard a few minutes of Karen Teixeira before I lost contact with her voice. But I did look at her presentation, so I have a sense of the content. And I thought it was very valuable content in terms of the details and that she included. And secondly, because of the panoramic picture she gave from 1962 to the present time, I thought that was very valuable. I didn't hear Dr. Hussain, anything that he said, but I saw, I don't know if I'm mistaken, but I think I saw 3 slides or 4 slides. And anyway, that is what I captured before I went offline. And what can I say? The things that he is saying, which captured some of what Karen said in graphic form, are are very, very important things for us to appreciate and understand about how our country has traveled. Now, I just have a few minutes and I want to make a few points. I will not speak directly to what they said, but it is connected. Now, in all of this journey over the last 60 years, Trinidad and Tobago did become a high-income country, so classified by the OECD and World Bank and other institutions. But inevitably, we became caught up in what you might call a middle-income trap. We had a higher per capita income than Costa Rica, which is regarded as a progressive country. We had a higher per capita income than Malaysia. We didn't come anywhere near Bermuda or Cayman Islands or Singapore. But the point is that we were in a pretty good place, but you got caught up in this middle income trap, partly because of our energy dependence, the Dutch disease phenomenon, which Roger likes to talk about. But more importantly, we found ourselves unable to feed ourselves. And secondly, unable to export our way to foreign exchange sustainability. And now that we are caught up in that trap, we are unable to see our way forward. And I think that's part of the problem that we are now facing on the economic front. The other thing is that you can't measure progress in independence on the basis of economics alone, although in my view, that is the most important criterion, but you need other things as well. How did we do in national unity and cohesion? I won't make a judgment call at this point, but I will say we could have done better. How did we do in participatory democracy? Again, I won't make a judgment call, but I would say that we can do a lot better. What about responsive government? I think we could do a whole lot better. Karen talked about inequality in the society, which has persisted, and poverty, the persistence of that. How did we do in shared prosperity? Not very good. How did we do in terms of trust between leaders and the people? Not very well at all. Do we have political parties that are truly national? Not really. They say so, and one has governed for nearly more than half the time that we've been independent. But these are really very partisan political parties. And the sense of nationhood for the political party system is very lacking in Trinidad and Tobago. How did we do in education? We might have made some progress in education, but given the dropout rate in primary school, the significant wastage in secondary school system, and the extent to which we allow the tertiary system to produce, but the economy is not able to absorb, and we have a significant brain drain and through migration there, I think we have a problem. And therefore, we have an issue in which the tangibles of investment have not been capitalized upon because of the intangibles that we need in development, which are the human capital issues, the intellectual capital issues, and the social capital and cohesion issues that you need in a society in order to really make your economy and your country and your society sing. I just want to close by mentioning 6 basic headlines. Besides the energy dependence issue, I mean, what we really should be striving for is energy independence in the way that the United States talks about it, without fossil fuel dependence in the way that we are caught. So there's no way that a sunlight-filled country like this with plenty wind and plenty sea power, Caribbean Sea all around it, cannot have sustainable energy if we set our mind to it and say, give us a 20-year horizon in order to do that. And we still have a problem with food and water. We cannot, I don't know what is wrong with us. When the pandemic hit, we said we are going to have a crisis. We're going to have a food crisis. We said we must get to the land and start to plant. Even the roadmap committee said that. But I don't think anything has been done. And we still have a water problem. We could hardly get water in every home on a consistent basis in Trinidad and Tobago. This is a 60-year-old independent country. What about if we mention these things that are global problems, but are also significant local problems there? Crime, health, jobs, environment, immigration. Those are challenges that we have to deal with, and we must find solutions for them. You know, we cannot only state what the situation is, we must have solutions for how to create jobs, and there are ways of doing that. I mean, I can't spend the time focusing on that now, but I mentioned it in the education and human and social capital issue. The problem of finance and economy, but more important than that, investment and the trade balance and the consequence of those things, which are the foreign exchange earnings and the debt issue and the reduction in per capita income and GDP, which creates the conditions that make it difficult for us to repay the debt, which really creates a problem for Trinidad and Tobago. I think that we've gotten to the point where we must have clear steps to a sustainable future as a multi-island nation, and I do not say that without meaning it. We are a multi-island nation. We must understand what that means in today's world and what that means in spite of COVID, the war, all the things that are happening economically, geopolitically in this era in which sustainable development and COP26 is so critical, all the decisions that were made there. And then the final thing is that I don't understand what, I think we have never really taken our sovereignty seriously as a country. We don't stand up for ourselves. In the world, we don't stand up against our government when they're playing the fool. We don't insist on higher standards in the country when corruption is rife and when unethical conduct is all over the place and basically embarrassing in the highest order. And we have got to find a way of making sovereignty meaningful to us as citizens and capturing the meaning of that and allowing us to be the kind of citizens we need to be. And secondly, we need to understand that we have to have a place in the world or else we will be nothing. Just like an individual strives to educate himself and develop himself and create the conditions in which he can engage the economy and the society, etc., in order to be somebody in the world. Just so a country has to do the necessary things to be a country in the world of significance. You may not be the wealthiest country, you may not be the biggest country, you may not be the most successful country, but people must have a sense in the world of what you stand for, what you believe in, what it is that drives these people called Trinbagonians. What is it that is meaningful to them? And therefore, what can they contribute to the world that is special and unique to them? And we have it. but we are not capitalizing on it. I think our biggest problem in Trinidad and Tobago, and people will probably be angry with me when I say this, because we think of ourselves as so creative and we could do this and so on. But I think our biggest problem in Trinidad and Tobago is that we don't have the required guts to make ourselves as a country into something. And secondly, we don't bring our collective imaginations to bear on the sustainable solutions for our country. Because we have bright people, we have Nobel Prize winners, we have people who have distinguished themselves all over the world and distinguished themselves here. But we have no sense of collective imagination to get anything done together for a country. And that would be my short contribution in partial response to the two presentations, but also in response to the fact of my frustration as a citizen after 60 years of independence.
Dr. Tiwari, thank you very much for your comments. And indeed, it did provide a really nice segue into some of the questions that I know that the audience has. I noted two persons who have their hands up. I would like to invite Mr. Bagalu to unmute your mic and ask your question.
Hi, good evening, everyone. And just as Dr. Tiwari wind up there, you know, it's as he's correct, there is not what your country can do for you, is what you yourself can do for your country as well too. And so let me just go here to start by saying it's very nice to see Miss Tishera. She was my former MP at that point when she was a member, when she was the Minister of Finance. And you know, every week I used to go to her constituency office, not to argue, but to debate certain things and whatever it is there. I don't know if she remembers that, but very nice presentation there. By the way, you look very well. So you started from scratch and you came all the way up there, and you know, you brought us from where we were, where we ought to be, and so on, and which is very, very good point. But with respect to oil and gas, you made mention that you know, we're doing relatively well. I agree to that point, but we must ask ourselves the question: are we producing enough to benefit from that, given everything taking place in the world? But what stood out here for me was when you mentioned about food security being one policy that they ought to look at there. I agree. And with respect to the reviewing government policy, the laws, the legislation, and so on there, it's very important. But you know, Dr. Hussein, Professor Gonzalez, even other economists like Dr. Sajiwan, Dr. Arjun, even Dr. Ramki Soon, they have been advising that, look, this too much talk, action has to be done. And Dr. Hussein made a very nice point there a while ago when he said that the Minister of Finance, the current Minister of Finance, is portraying that everything is well, all is well, when with respect to reality, it isn't. Now, with respect to the economy, now, as a former Minister of Finance, Ms. Tishera there, you know, you served in cabinet and being well experienced and so on there. What would your advice be to the current Minister of Finance with respect, and not even just the Minister of Finance, but all involved with respect to food security? We need to review policy, because with the way things are heading now, we are going to head for a very bad food crisis if this continues. And my question, and even Dr. Tiwari, Dr. Hussein could intervene as well too, but to you, what would you advise with regards to that where policy is concerned?
Thank you for your question. I will allow all of the panelists to answer the questions in this given round. I would like to invite Mr. Chedi to unmute your mic and you can ask your question, sir. Mr. Chedi.
So Karen, thank you for going through the history of, that was a very good look back. I tend to look at our economic situation today And I know there are many things that impact it. For example, our history or colonial history, the plantation economy. I think of the inevitable consequences of Dutch disease on Trinidad's economy. But then I think you stressed something that was not usually included in most economists' analysis, which is the impact of the drug trade. And I tend to think of the drug trade as having a direct impact on a sense of security and on the proliferation of crime. But I think you were getting to something a little further than that when you talked about red tape. When you talked about red tape, you talked about those who benefit from the bureaucracy, the immovable bureaucracy, and how it keeps the small man out. It seems to me that when I look at our terrible ease of doing business measures, I always think of it as this is the result of inertia. This is the result of the things that we haven't done. But I think you were going to something much further than that, and that you were saying that there are forces that benefit from this lack of effectiveness of the government bureaucracy. And those forces are intent on keeping it that way. So I shouldn't think of our bad EODB numbers as being the consequence of default lack of action, but rather the consequence of deliberate forces. Am I interpreting that, what you said, correctly?
I will just ask Mr. Chair, unmute your mic and you can probably answer the two questions as quick as we can, as I know our
Time is going.
session
Yes.
time, yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so I would want to say this. I think I speak with the sense of confidence on the topic because I was in there. I was in there, and I was in there at a very position as a Minister of Finance. And I had a very good relationship with the Prime Minister. One, because I guess my position being new, and he previously had about 4 ministers in the Ministry of Finance, and you just had myself and Mariano. And I think he believed that I did support his vision, strategic vision for Trinidad and Tobago. There's no question in my mind, you know, and I probably, is not what the gentleman just said is about right. That thing about the red tape, I didn't put that up, you know. When I looked at the corruption perception index for the public sector, they gave these 6 factors that drive corruption in the corruption perception, and one of them was red tape. And you know that just clicked with me. And yes, you're right, because where are all these unlicensed guns coming from? Why is there such a heavy crime? Let us not pretend that we don't understand. Yes, there's some domestic crime, but even among the domestic crime, many people are on drugs. You have to understand that a lot of the laws, and maybe I have this understanding because some of them were around when I was a minister, the Revenue Authority, they have diluted it completely. And we don't have time to go into it. The gambling legislation, we should not have gambling in this country. We have too much money laundering. EU has blacklisted us. You saw they had a meeting in Barbados with Mia and the Prime Minister about de-risking and the bank, the correspondent bank. De-risking meaning taking you off completely. You see the Prime Minister has run off to Washington for 4 days to discuss that topic. This country is a corrupt country. And if people want to pretend that they do not understand that at the root of this corruption in this country is the transshipment of cocaine that is able to give people power to open up businesses, for the businesses to fail, for the businesses to reopen, to have the politicians jump in at their call. The Procurement Act is a perfect example of the level of corruption in this country. And yes, it's deliberate. All the reports. I know I was inside there, and I can say no, I might be wrong, and I might be biased, because I know somebody who I'm seeing to the right of me has said Mr. Manning was the worst Prime Minister Trinidad and Tobago ever had. I won't look at him, but he said that. But I will say that unfortunately he did not have the opportunity to meet and work with him, because one of the things that he was in my view, this is what I picked up. I think that he was now prime minister. I think he wanted to end. He wanted to come out. He wanted to go and preach or whatever he wanted to do, which that's a whole different issue. And I think he wanted to leave and deal with the drug trade. I'm telling you that. I'm not asking you that. I can't tell you the names that he called to me. I can't call the names to you. But if I tell you the names that he called to me, who are the big business in this country, you might be shocked. I'm not asking you if somebody told me that he told me. I'm telling you that he told me. I am telling you that when I was setting up the financial intelligence unit, I knew who wanted the job. I know what jobs they want. I'm not going to say what jobs they want. And I know who wants those jobs, because those are the jobs that allow them to be able to get sensitive information. I'm just telling you that. And I told the Prime Minister, the person who I knew wanted the job, I said, he's not getting it, because I know he wants it, and he wants it for the wrong reason. We got the Americans to come in from Washington and met with me. And I said, get me ahead of the effort, because the leadership, when you want to end a movement, Dr. Tuari, you don't go after the crowd. You go after the head. You go after JFK. You go after whoever is leading Martin Luther King. And then the movement disappears. So you go to the head. And I am telling you, I said, I don't want a Trinidadian. I don't want a Caribbean person there, because I don't want them heading up that FIU. And they brought the Washington people to me, and we were looking at somebody from the Central America. You don't think he understood the Revenue Authority, what he was doing? We had people from the American DA assisting us, Customs Department, setting up the Revenue Authority to set up and to develop one PIN number, because we understood that what Mr. Manning understood, and I understood that he understood that with the gambling. He understood that why you letting the drugs in, because you're leaving your no gate, a dog, no guard, no nothing. You're letting it in, and sometimes the same people, which we have a national budget, and the three top items in our national budget are national security, health, and education. You look at Barbados, national security must be number 10. We're spending so much money on national security, and many of the private firms get the work. Look, you saw that whole scandal with the police commissioner, with all those cars and all those contracts he broke, allegedly. That was in the papers. I didn't say that. And I am telling you in no uncertain terms that at the root of our problem, and we will, because why haven't we been able to solve it? Why have we not been able to solve it? Because at the root of our problem, there are people who have power in this country that set, I was approached 3 times. They realized, well, I don't take a bribe. I don't take a bribe. But they didn't come and ask, they didn't come at something big, They came at something small to test me out, to see if I would think. But as soon as they tell me anything, I went to Mr. Manning. So they realized, don't tell her anything, because she ran in and tell Mr. Manning. So I am telling you, I have no doubt those OPVs, the Revenue Authority, the gambling legislation, the FIU, the sort where you had to get polygraph testing and you had to get tested for drug testing. I have no doubt until you dealt with the root cause, you will never solve the problem of crime in this country. And by the way, my last little point is this. We love to talk about the cockroaches and zesters and using as code Laventilla mover, which everybody knows what they mean by Laventilla mover. But I always say to people, if in fact this is a problem of a race, why isn't Tobago overrun with crime? Why isn't Maruga overrun with crime? Why isn't Point Fortin overrun with crime? Why isn't Toko overrun with crime? Because those are rural communities, and they go to that urban community, which is already very, very easily taken advantage of, very vulnerable, and they recruit, and they sit down wherever they have to sit down, and they call the shots. And a lot of the legislation, those private-public partnership, which small businessman could ever apply to do a project unless the government says, listen, we're giving half of the project to the small businessman. Why doesn't the government insist on certain of their supporters? I'm talking about whether contractors or big businessmen. Why don't we look at their history to see if they have been successful in or their cost of run? I am giving you the real story. You see all the story, how it sounds nice and all the things you're supposed to do and how it sounds lovely and all the philosophical thing. It sounds really, really, really nice. I'm telling you from the inside, and none of them going to do it. If you have an AG that had to recuse himself 46 times, how you could have him as Attorney General? Because the recusal means conflict of interest. And he sat down there and 46 recusals and he was still sitting down there. How you have a Minister of Agriculture who tells you he's missing his family for 19 months, he's still not left, he's still here, and you have a lesser position than the new minister can fire him tomorrow morning. How you could have a prime minister who moved the minister of tourism in, and you know they never tell me anything because it is a fact. You could only sue for defamation if it's not true. He moved them from housing, put him in tourism, then suddenly became the Minister of Housing for about 8 months. During that period, signed this what they call it's a framework agreement for the Chinese who had been blacklisted to build 5,000 houses with Chinese labor and pay them in US. And then pretend he didn't know about it until the Freedom of Information Act was forced, and then he claimed he didn't know. That is, there's no trust in this government. The AV drilling. How do you explain that your senior counsel, highly respected, is telling you go to court and challenge that thing? I had read judgments. Why won't you go? But you pay him 100 million. There's no trust in this government for good reason. And I am not playing the nice game about, no, it's all nice. It sounds nice. Or that. That's the reality. And the reason why the country is hopeless, Dr. Tiwari, as you know, because both parties are seen as being corrupt. And therefore, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. And what allows them to sustain their nonsense is because they use the race and the religion as a separator of two groups. But I am telling you from the inside, that is what is destroying our country. I
agree with that.
And 100%. I'm not asking you, listeners, I'm telling you, he called names. And when I see some of those names in the top position in this country, I am sure about my views of this government. That's why, by the way, they didn't offer me a position. I wouldn't have taken it because they would have fired me.
Thank you very much, Ms. Teixeira, for unpacking some of the things that we've been seeing. But ladies and gentlemen, we are very close to the end of our designated time, and I would like to ask our panelists to wrap up in terms of refocusing. Ms. Teixeira has indicated that those were indeed her wrap-up points. So I'm going to ask Dr. Tiwari just to be able to also reflect on a term that was raised in the presentations earlier, and that is the pulse of the nation. Talking about the pulse of the nation.
Right. Yeah.
Where are we as an economy now? What should be our priorities? How do we begin to rein in our economic performance? And then I will hand over to Dr. Hossain.
Okay, that's too hard a question to try and answer now in a short time. But what I would say is that I want to start by agreeing with Karen Teixeira that there is no way that you can solve the big economic challenges in this country unless you are prepared to deal with corruption and drugs that are connected with crime and criminality. and that they are three parts of the same thing. And unless you are prepared to deal with that interlocking relationship, it is very hard to get the kind of space to address the major economic and financial challenges that you must address in this country. So I want to be one with her on that little principle. The second thing is that I believe, however bad it is and how many mistakes we've made, we've got to start. And the world is in such a crisis now, and we ourselves are in such a crisis. You might as well start now, because anything you have to do that we must do, we better do it now. I don't know why we do not wish to address the issue of food security and imports reduction, for instance. I don't know why we do not wish to address the issue of import substitution in Trinidad and Tobago. And we don't have to go very far to look at many things. I mean, we don't have to bring back Caroni Limited, but we could have the cultivation of sugar, the production of sugar anyway. And we don't have to go with the old system either. We could have the production of sugar in a certain way to deal with the import question, which is quite significant for sugar, and that goes into every manufacturer in the country. And we can look at the value chain for the production process in Trinidad and Tobago and see what we can substitute in terms of imports in Trinidad and Tobago. We could make those kinds of things. So you produce your food, you cut your imports, at least you begin in food, and you look at the value chain to see what you can produce. The second thing is that we have produced between 1978 and 2022 only about 30,000 houses by the state in Trinidad and Tobago. And when you think of how much money has been spent in housing by the state, you know that the justification for 30,000 houses, whichever the government, for that cost has to involve some miscarriage of money. And that tells you that if you want to create jobs in the country, construction is one of the ways, but you can't give government the work, really. You've got to find a way of providing houses. We have 450,000 households in this country. We have more than, with COVID now, we have more than 30% of the population that is poor, 30% of the households. And if you want to deal with inequality, you have to deal with this thing household by household. And the second thing that you have to do is that you have to give people homes so that they have a sense of property. You need to bring them into the mainstream economy. You've got to give them jobs so that they could pay for the homes, and you don't create a kind of political catchment by creating communities that are basically beholden to the political directorate. So the whole housing strategy has to be changed, transformed to deal with the question of poverty for those who are already living there. And secondly, to deal with the issue of equity in Trinidad and Tobago, and to deal with income earning households. Whether you have to skill them, you have to train them, you align it to economic development, etc., you have to do that. The third thing, I think, and I'll only mention four, is the issue of export investment. You have to bring investment into the country, whether local or foreign, and they have to be tied to exports, whether existing exporting companies that are expanding or new exporting companies to other countries because of who you get to invest, bring in the market with them. And the fourth area I would mention is that we've got to get this digitalization that everybody is talking right. Because there is no way you can enter that world that is going to take off. It's already taken off, but it's going to take off after this crisis in the logistics and supply chains and so on is gone, after the war in Ukraine is over. It's going to then take off. That world of automation, artificial intelligence, robotics, metaverse, that is a different world that is not, Trinidad and Tobago is not connected to it at all. So my own feeling is that we've got to do the preparation necessary to connect to that world, because we've got to create a part of the economy that is being created in the world for ourselves. All right, it is better we get in on the ground floor of that. And I want to add to that, it is not so difficult. We have a robotics company in Trinidad and Tobago, very successful. Everybody in there is a university graduate Trinidadian, university graduate Trinidadian, either from UE, UTT, or from some university abroad who has come back home. So it's not a lot, it's about 20, 25 people, but they are tied to the global system and they are producing at the level that is required for them. So my own feeling is if we dealt with agriculture differently and food security, housing differently, so that it is not as corrupt as it is and unproductive as it is, export investment with a strategy related to the trade agreements that we have, and to a neighborhood strategy in which the world is ceasing now to deal with countries all over the world. What you have is a kind of neighborhood developing around countries. And if we could get this digitalization correct enough, perfect enough to be part of that new economy that is emerging and going to take off, I think we could begin to start. And that is just 4 things. You could make them 4 projects, put 4 gifted people in charge of them, one after the other, let them recruit the people, get the projects going, tie the things together, and get them going. Trinidad and Tobago is a little place, 1.4 million people. That is a village in Nigeria, a village in China, a village in India, a village in Pakistan. You know, I mean, we are making joke with a country that is one of the most beautiful countries in the world, and we are destroying it year by year. And I think I'm getting to the point where I'm really fed up to see what is happening here, and something must be done.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tiwari. Dr. Hussain, your closing comments, please. You can unmute your mic and post your comments.
Right, Rebecca, I'll just close up by saying thank you to you and Christian for organizing and hosting the session. Thanks to Dr. Tiwari and Karen for participating. I was really impressed with them both. We would certainly have Karen back again. You know, we like the frank, direct conversation. We may not agree on everything, but it's important to be direct and explain to the audience in the careful chronological way that she did the event. So having said that, thank you all very much. I know we switched from Friday to Wednesday. Thanks for all of you who joined, and let us move forward and have a good and productive week.
Yes. Good evening,
Thank
everyone.
you.
As Dr. Hussain said, we have transitioned the session from the Friday evening to the Wednesday, and this is because as the economy has opened up, other types of activities take precedence on our Friday evening, and we wanted to, from the perspective of the university, to continue to provide this platform for frank, open conversation. So please continue to support us, continue to look out for our blasts, continue to look out for our emails to be able to further these types of very necessary conversation for our economic development. Have a pleasant evening. Thank you to all my panelists, and thank you to you, the audience. Good night, everyone.